Welcome and thank you for joining us. We'll just get started in one minute or so, but if you want to take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat, that would be great. Just your name and where you're from and what you hope to learn tonight.
All right. We still have a couple people popping in, but we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight for our Countering Election Misinformation and Disinformation training with Common Cause. We're going to kick off the evening with our land acknowledgement that I gave a little precursor to just now. All right. Open Democracy likes to acknowledge that we do our work on Indakina, the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways and the people who have stewarded Indakina throughout the generations and continue to do so today. All right, and with that, I will go ahead and stop sharing this. And I'm excited to introduce this evening's presenter, Audrey McCabe, Information Accountability Analyst with Common Cause. In her current role, Audrey works to combat online disinformation that aims to intimidate voters and undermine trust in American elections. Her work involves tracking emerging false narratives and briefing partners and volunteers on how to prevent the spread of disinformation. Prior to joining Common Cause, Audrey was a researcher at Media Matters, a progressive research center dedicated to correcting right-wing misinformation in the U.S. media. She holds a bachelor's and master's degree in politics from the New York, not New Hampshire, University. Thank you so much for being here tonight and sharing your extensive knowledge on countering election misinformation with us, Audrey. Let's get started.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Autumn, for the introduction. I'm really excited to be speaking with all of you today. Like Autumn said, I am the Information Accountability Analyst for the National Office of Common Cause. Autumn, if you wouldn't mind hitting the slide. I just want to tell you a little bit about Common Cause. We are a grassroots driven nonprofit organization founded in 1970 for the purpose of fighting for democratic principles. Common Cause strengthens our democracy against the challenges it faces through state and national policy expertise, a massive network of grassroots supporters, and importantly, a nonpartisan approach. We work at every level of government on priorities that impact each of our lives. For example, defending the right to vote, limiting big money's influence on elections and politics, and holding public officials accountable. Our national headquarters, which I work out of, is located in DC, and we also have more than 25 state offices around the country, and those are all led by teams of on-the-ground specialists who know how to win impactful reforms within their own communities. New Hampshire, unfortunately, is one of the states where we do not yet have an office, and so I'm really excited that we are working with you all here at Open Democracy tonight. Definitely filling a gap that we have. I want to tell you a little bit about my work at Common Cause. I track disinformation related to democracy and elections, mostly on social media. I studied extremism in undergrad and grad school and spent the last 2 years before I joined Common Cause researching and analyzing disinformation trends, specifically in right-wing media. So suffice to say, I find this topic really interesting, and I believe that anti-disinformation work is really essential in maintaining Americans' faith in our electoral systems and in our democracy. And so I'm really happy that you all want to learn more about it today. If you could just hit the slide for me, Autumn. I just want to walk us through our agenda for the evening. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the differences between mis and disinformation, how to verify election information, so essentially how to fact check, how to share information that will help maintain faith in American elections and why that content matters, the best practices for responding or not responding to mis and disinformation that you see online, submitting content to our tip line, a little bit about the election information landscape in New Hampshire. And lastly, I just want to mention that you are going to see some links on these slides, and I am going to send the slides in the chat. I'm actually going to do that right now before I forget, so that you will have access, and you can just, when you open up the slides, just hit the space bar to go through them, and you will be able to click on all of those links and access those resources, see any of the information, so you don't have to jot everything down. So I'm just going to start off by explaining a little bit about the difference between mis and disinformation. So you're often going to hear experts and policymakers and advocates use those terms interchangeably. And that's because often they're really difficult to distinguish between when we don't know the intention behind the person who's spreading them. But their technical definitions are different, and I want to provide some clarity for you all on what those terms mean. If you wouldn't mind hitting the slide, Autumn. Misinformation, and you could just, disinformation is false information that is spread intentionally. So for example, let's say a printer at a New Hampshire polling place was jammed and it stopped working and it was causing some problems at the polling place. Someone might know that the printer jam is just sort of a run-of-the-mill technical issue. Those things happen during elections, and that it's going to be resolved quickly and it's not going to impact the election. But maybe someone chose to manipulate the event to cast doubts on the result of the election. So for example, they might suggest that someone intentionally jammed the printer on purpose to disenfranchise voters. And maybe that's because that person wanted more views on social media, they wanted more traction, or maybe they had some sort of political gain. Other forms of disinformation might include AI-generated deepfakes. So I'm sure many of you remember the fake robocall that New Hampshire voters got impersonating Biden that told them not to vote in primaries. That's a really dangerous form of a deepfake used to interfere with elections. This also includes other forms of edited or doctored audio or images, conspiracy theories, the use of intimidation and fear tactics, or targeting communities with false voting information. Misinformation, on the other hand, is inaccurate information posted by someone who isn't aware that the information is false. So if we were to use the printer example again, a form of misinformation would be that somebody hears that a printer is jammed when it actually is not, spreads that information thinking that it's true, and is not aware they're actually spreading misinformation. So other examples might include sharing out-of-date voting instructions, replying to disinformation that they see online, which amplifies its reach, or cross-posting disinformation. And cross-posting is where someone shares a post from one platform to another, usually via screenshot. So if I saw a form of disinformation in a closed Facebook group and I decided to take a screenshot of it and I posted that on my Twitter, then that exposes a lot more people to that content who might not be able to know if it's true or not. So that's something that we really want to prevent. You go to the next slide. Yep. So one of the most important aspects of anti-disinformation work is understanding where you can actually get reliable information to begin with. A lot of false narratives that circulate online take a story or a scenario that is maybe partially true, maybe a little bit grounded in the truth, but takes it really out of context or twists aspects of it to stoke fears. So understanding where you can find reliable information when you see false narratives online is an important first step in understanding how you can spot false narratives and how to address them. So I've linked a couple of things in this slide, a few useful resources. PolitiFact.com is a useful resource for fact-checking claims that you see online. The search button on the upper left side can help you narrow down to a specific topic that you might have seen. But the website also has a newsletter if you want to just keep up to date on false narratives that are circulating. This does not only focus on election misinformation, but that is a big part of what we're seeing these days leading up to the election. So that's definitely going to be a big topic for that site these days. If you see election instructions that you believe are incorrect and are potentially misleading voters in your community, you can check out the New Hampshire Secretary of State Elections website for up-to-date information. And lastly, the website Verified Voting has some helpful resources for understanding the election process specific to your state. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about best practices for responding to misinformation and disinformation and verifying the claims that you see. So as we discussed, misinformation is false information that was posted by someone who believed it to be true. So your instinct might be to comment on the post to inform the author and others that the information is incorrect. But any type of engagement on is only going to amplify it. It's going to make more people see it. If you comment on it, then maybe your friends and followers are going to see it. They might not even see your comment on it, or they might disagree with your comment and just believe that it's true. So the best thing that you can do is to message the poster privately and request that they correct or remove the content. It's also great if you can provide a reliable, trusted source refuting the inaccurate information that they post. It's really important to just stay cool, calm, collected in those messages and just say, hey, I'm not totally sure about that. Like, here's another resource for you to look at. I think the information that you posted might be a little bit incorrect. So another way to respond is to actually share correct information on the topic through your own social media without reference to the post or poster of misinformation that you saw. So let's say somebody posted outdated or incorrect voting information for your community. Something that you can do is go on your own page and post accurate information, making no reference to the misinformation that had been spread, and just making sure that more people have access to the information that they need. And if a poster is a close member of your community, you can consider engaging in a conversation with them about election mis and disinformation. And I have linked a guide on this slide for talking to friends and family about election lies. My wonderful coworker, Reelin, made a really cool video about how to have those kinds of conversations. As for reacting to disinformation, really the main takeaway that I want you to have is that you should not engage with disinformation. Again, you might be really tempted to comment on the post and say, hey, this isn't true, this is a lie, but it's really important to resist that urge because any kind of interaction with that post is only going to amplify it. It's only going to make more people see it. And you know that it's false, but the people that you're amplifying it to might not. And a lot of the time, the people who spread disinformation, their entire goal is to get as many clicks as they can, to get as many comments, just to get as much engagement as possible. So if you give them an angry comment and you say, this isn't true, you're only helping them with their goal of trying to get more clicks. We also want to make sure that we are cross-posting good information and not bad information. So if you see election lies spreading on Facebook, help contain them by not sharing them to other platforms. Even if it's just a screenshot with a comment saying, this isn't true, this is the correct information. When you're sharing that screenshot, somebody else can take that photo without the context that you've provided. One thing that you can do instead of just sitting still when you see disinformation is to report it to our tip line, which I will explain in a moment. Next up, I'm going to explain a little bit about how to react to voter confusion. So that's another type of content that you might see online. And this is not a form of mis or disinformation. It's just a lack of access to correct information. So maybe somebody in your neighborhood is confused about which polling place to go to or what they need to bring them to the polls. And if you see a post that does not contain any harmful information, but it's just asking for assistance, you can help connect the poster to valid information using the resources that I've linked in this slide. And again, in those cases, good to just kind of assume the best and really, help that person get the information that they need. And then when it comes to sharing election information, once you have, fact-checked claim, decided how to respond or not respond, it's also important to consider what we can do to prevent forms of mis and disinformation. So research has shown that inoculation content basically content that provides accurate information about elections, particularly about what people should expect when they go to the polls, or resources for them to have more information. This goes really long way in preventing people from believing the mis and disinformation that they are going to be exposed to, and that debunking claims after they have already been read does not work as well as this kind of inoculation content. So there are a couple of examples on this slide. The one that states some things are worth the wait reminds readers that lines on the polls are not unusual and are not suspect. And that's something that they can anticipate. So people won't assume the worst when they show up to the polls and they've got a little bit of a line. And the other example reminds readers that sometimes technical issues happen in elections and they should turn to a poll worker for help rather than turning to Twitter and saying, the internet went down, or there's a printer jammed, or something of that sort. Unfortunately, these technical issues just happen. It's a super normal part of voting. And unfortunately, we're seeing those little errors be weaponized by bad actors who want to sow distrust in American elections. So being able to spread this content to help remind people that our elections are safe and secure and to not assume the worst about any difficulties that they may encounter during the voting process is really helpful. And so anyone can really be a part of this line of defense by posting content on their social media platforms or just sharing them with your friends and family. Maybe you have a group chat where people would appreciate these kinds of things. And I've linked our inoculation content library on this slide so you can check it out. You can feel free to share this content at any time that you want, but it's definitely most helpful during voting periods. So the QR scan is going to take you to that, or if you click on the link on inoculation content library. We have a lot of really fun little graphics and things on different topics related to elections and voting. We also have a tip line. So when you see disinformation, we encourage you to submit the content to our tip line, and this helps us keep track of emerging trends in the disinformation world and helps us know what kind of inoculation content we need to develop and for our volunteers and supporters to be promoting. There are certain platforms and communities that are really helpful for us to have an eye on. So if you're interested in particularly seeking out disinformation or reporting disinformation that you see in your community to our tip line, it's really good for you to have an eye on what naturally pops up on your feed. But it's also not a bad idea to break outside of your normal bubble. So maybe joining private online spaces that you weren't in before. It can still be, part of your your neighborhood, but something that you're not already in. That's really an extra set of eyes for us to understand if any disinformation is really growing in these groups and what potential theories are emerging. But we absolutely do not suggest that you join any particularly hostile groups, like groups encouraging violence or unrest. We're not encouraging any form of sort of espionage. This is really just sort of a way for us to have eyes on potential groups that we just might not see normally in our social media monitoring. And so our tip line, you can access 24/7 on the website. It is reportdisinfo.org. And this QR code, you can scan with your phone and it will take you to it. And then we also accept tips via SMS and WhatsApp. As for submitting tips, important to take a screenshot. And then if you are able to take a link for the post, and then fill out a report form that's just going to be a little bit of a description of what you're seeing it, potentially the narrative or the spread, and then review and submit your tip. It's pretty user-friendly and straightforward. As for what to submit to our tip line, obviously there are a lot of forms of inaccurate information floating around on the internet. That doesn't mean that we need to see a screenshot of every single piece of inaccurate information. So the things that we're really looking for are specific to elections. We're also looking for recent content. So hopefully in the past few months is best, even in the past month is even better. Also looking for things with high engagement. So that's more than 10 shares or 10 retweets, things like that. If you see, an inaccurate post that has maybe like one like by an account that doesn't really have any friends, doesn't really have any followers, that's not something that's probably gaining a lot of traction. And so we don't necessarily need to be looking into that. Also, primary sources are best. If you see someone reposting a news article that is inaccurate, but they're not adding any extra information to it, there's no caption that they're adding, that's something that we don't necessarily need to see. We're going to try to find that at the source. Incidents at the polls are also helpful for us to see what's going on the ground. And also the information that you use to reply to voters is actually something that you can submit to our tip line. We're not going to consider that disinformation, just a useful way for us to be able to see it, just to understand ways that people are, volunteers are engaging with their communities to spread accurate information. Other things that we don't want to see include your online argument. As I mentioned, best to leave mis and disinformation alone. And so even if you end up having a private conversation with someone and are sharing your viewpoints with them, best to keep that to yourself and just submit the disinformation that you were seeing in the original post. Then I just want to talk a little bit about the election information landscape specific to New Hampshire. We have an organization that we work with that has been identifying critical gaps in specific states. So New Hampshire has a very decentralized and hyper-local system of administering elections, and that actually increases the potential that clerks and administrators could potentially oppose the certification of elections for any number of reasons, whether or not those reasons are valid. And so that's a narrative that we're going to kind of keep an eye on when it comes to disinformation specifically for New Hampshire voters. There also have been a lot of new laws, specifically this year, that could potentially confuse voters and create a gap for bad actors to spread disinformation about voting processes. And then I also linked at the bottom of this slide a database of election deniers. I did take a look today at New Hampshire, and you guys have an incredibly low number of election deniers that have run for or are currently holding office. And so go New Hampshire. I was very impressed by that. But if you want to check it out, that link is there. You can check out the database. And then I also just wanted to mention that local news sources can be super, super helpful for understanding what is going on the ground. It's a really great way to get information that's not necessarily being covered by national media, especially when it comes to what's happening at polling places. There are certain local news sources that can be vectors for national bad actors to spread disinformation on a more micro scale to communities. And so it's important to make sure that the local news sources that you are getting information from are accurate and reliable sources. I did speak to my colleague who lives in New Hampshire, and she recommended New Hampshire Public Radio, the New Hampshire Bulletin, and the Concord Monitor as potential sources for accurate information. And I just wanted to end with our call to action as we wrap up. I hope that you all learned from this. And I just wanted to share that we would love for you to consider sharing our inoculation content with your friends and family, post it on your social media, and also report disinformation to our tip line when you see it. That is it for my presentation, for my training, but I would love to answer any questions that anyone might have. If you want to just throw them in the chat. Yes, In-Depth NH is another online news source. Yes, I am not an expert on New Hampshire. Unfortunately, I have heard nothing but wonderful things about it. I am not an expert on the information landscape in New Hampshire. And so if you have any reliable sources that you rely on for your news specific to New Hampshire, please feel free to share those.
Can I just ask my question out loud? So today I saw a social media post that said vote on November 8th. And we all know that the election day is November 5th. And then I looked closer and I saw that somebody shared a 2022 election related content. So of course, in 2022, the election day was November 8th. And I just called that person and said, hey, just so you know, you shared content that you probably shouldn't have shared. And this year's election date is November 5th. But when we see that and we don't know the person who shared it, what is your recommendation if you don't know who posted the wrong date?
Yeah, so that's an excellent example of exactly what you should do. A lot of times it's good to assume the best, to not assume that this person is trying to sow chaos. So if you don't know the person, it's good to consider what the motive might be of the person who's posting. So if it's someone who has thousands of followers and you look at their account and 90% of it is disinformation and they're clearly trying to get people riled up and they're spreading lies because they know they'll get followers from it, then you want to just choose to not engage with it. You can submit it to our tip line, but ultimately responding and sending a DM to that person is not going to be particularly helpful. If you see a user who is clearly not trying to make a particular impact on social media, somebody who's not really trying to gain traction, and you think it's possible that this was just an accident, this was a form of misinformation, then it would be appropriate to go ahead and say, hey, I don't know you, but I just wanted to let you know, like, election day is not on November 8th. It's actually earlier this year. Here's a link with the information on voting. That is a totally fine thing to do. You just want to consider the type of platform that the person has. So I would say generally large platform, lots of disinformation, shy away from interacting directly with them. But if it seems like someone who just made an innocent mistake and you want to help them out, then that would be totally fine.
I have a question actually. So one of our members had actually reached out to us recently to let us know about some misinformation that was being spread on the radio. Do you accept that kind of tip on the hotline, or is it strictly for digital media?
Right now, we're focusing specifically on social media. In my old job, I was doing a lot of listening to radio shows, and unfortunately, that definitely is a place where disinformation is thriving at the moment. But that's not something that we are really taking in our tip line at the moment.
But I'll just if you hear disinformation on the radio or get a piece of mail that's disinformation, please just flag that to Open Democracy, and we can either, share it with our internal coalition, because we do want to know what people are saying, especially around the elections.
Mail is definitely being used to spread disinformation to voters. So that definitely is something to be on the lookout for. Unfortunate to have to fact check your mail, but unfortunately that is happening, especially as we get closer to the election. Any other questions for you?
Can I ask you a question about Nextdoor? Like, what social media, where are you seeing the most disinformation? I know a few years ago, Nextdoor and some of the other non-traditional apps that people use, or where we saw more misinformation than Facebook and Twitter. But where are you seeing it currently in 2024?
Yeah, so Nextdoor and sort of hyper local platforms like that are definitely areas where narratives can spread really quickly within specific communities. And they're not moderated in the same way. So platforms like Facebook and Instagram, for example, have certain content moderation practices in place in order to try to prevent that. And platforms like Nextdoor Neighbor are not as focused on shutting those kinds of things down. And so Next Door Neighbor is definitely an area where we actually hope to see people reporting disinformation to our tip line, because that's not something that we're monitoring day to day. Obviously, a lot of it is closed. And so that's definitely something that we're seeing a rise in. We also are unfortunately seeing a huge rise in disinformation spread on Twitter. Since Elon Musk's takeover, he really gutted his content moderation team, and he himself spreads a lot of disinformation pretty much on a daily basis, just on his own personal account. And so that's a platform where we're definitely keeping an eye on the spread.
What about Snopes? I've turned to Snopes quite a bit. It's been very helpful, but I mean, it doesn't just zero in on elections. But do you have any thoughts on Snopes?
Snopes, the fact-checking website. It
Yeah.
can be, yes, it can definitely be useful. I usually point people to PolitiFact. The information that they provide is more centered around elections and politics, and I believe Snopes covers a lot of different areas like pop culture. And so, to my knowledge, it's a reliable site, but I just don't necessarily point people towards it because a lot of election disinformation is going to be better fact checked by PolitiFact. Question for Bob. Have you identified known sources of disinformation we should know about specifically other than Musk? So what we are hoping to have people on the ground be kind of looking at is really what you're seeing on social media from people that you know in your life, or from influencers or social media users that show up in your feed. Disinformation can kind of come from anywhere and everywhere. Disinformation exists in more mainstream media sources, like People News or the radio, which we talked about. But today we're talking more specifically about social media. And so as for known sources, there are a lot of social media influencers. It would take me forever to kind of list all of those individuals or outlets that are spreading disinformation. But I think the point of what I want you to learn this evening is that it can kind of come from anywhere and everywhere, and it's unfortunately just something that is going to pop up on your feed, and that's really where you should be on the lookout for it.
And also, can you share a little bit more about your disinformation newsletter?
We do have a disinformation newsletter. That is something that we are mostly sharing with specifically partner organizations. And so, Olivia, that's something that you might have signed up for. That's not like an open thing that we have right now. But the disinformation tip line is something that we use to understand the narratives that are out there, the trends that are happening. And so then we are able to send out a newsletter to journalists and partners so they're able to inform their volunteers and members of what's happening.
And I just want to share something. Yesterday, the Concord Monitor reported New Hampshire is bucking the trend with poll worker recruitment. And there were 3 clerks or 4 clerks that the Concord Monitor talked to. And we know that Keene and Manchester and some other communities need poll workers. So even though that reporter correctly reported that Hopkinton has enough poll workers, it didn't necessarily reflect everything too. So when you see that kind of information, always feel free to share it with me. Somebody from Lebanon read something in the Lebanon newspaper about voting by absentee that a reporter just got incorrect, that we were able to follow up with reporters. So ComCause is doing that on the national level, but if you see things at the local level, I think reporters really do try to get the story correct. But occasionally there's pieces that, no fault to the Concord Monitor, the clerk she talked to were fully staffed, just that there were other clerks in the state that needed election workers.
Yeah. That's awesome. That's so important because local news is where so many people get a lot of information, especially when it comes to things like voting. And so being able to work with reporters and provide them with accurate information is also an important part of combating disinformation. And Olivia, I just wanted to ask, have you noticed any particular disinformation narratives floating around New Hampshire other than kind of the ones that I touched on? Just as someone who's familiar with the landscape there.
There's a lot of misinformation about you have to prove citizenship in order to register to vote. This is a law that passed that still waiting for the governor to sign. It is not the law of the land. So if you register to vote, you do not need to prove citizenship at this moment. But I do think it's important that, if you're talking to voters on how to register to vote, encouraging them to bring their birth certificate and a photo ID and the documents needed and not signing affidavits. But I think that if they have them, if they don't have a birth certificate and they need to sign an affidavit, they should know that that tool exists. But most of what I'm seeing is around there are non-citizens on the New Hampshire voter lists, and it's because we don't have a stringent rule on proof of citizenship. So that is a narrative we are seeing commonly.
That's definitely a nationwide trend as well that we're seeing in almost every single state is inaccurate information that has to do the supposed threat of non-citizens voting when we know that there's very little evidence that that happens particularly often.
The other thing I want to just urge folks to do is know that this program exists and explore those inoculation toolkits. They're really helpful for people wanting to share content on social media, but also if you have friends and neighbors that might be in different social media platforms than you, to invite them to know that this report disinformation tip line exists. So that if you're not using multiple platforms, some of your neighbors might be. Fran, do you have a question? No, okay.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. Like I said, it means a lot just to have people be interested in anti-disinformation work. It is not always super fun and exciting, but it is really, really important. Unfortunately, we're just seeing increasing amounts of bad information on the internet these days. And so I am really grateful to all of you for taking some time just to listen to this and learn more about it.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Thanks all.
Thank you.